Okay, last chapter. Chapter 12 of Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. Still, there was no word of Sherman and the lost army of the Tennessee. All over the country, and in Europe, too, people waited for word as they tried to guess what was happening. If he can do it, people said, if he can march 300 miles through enemy territory, then it is certain that the Confederacy is nearly spent. If Sherman can do it, then surely the war must be very near its close. But many remembered that Sherman had always been considered a little crazy. He looked wild. It was like him to attempt a mad, impossible feat like this. But Grant trusts him, someone said. Yes, replied others, and Grant has made any number of mistakes too. He's Mr. Big with old Abe, but that doesn't mean he's always right. Suddenly, in December, the waiting was over, and the Army of the Tennessee was again in contact with Washington. I beg to present you the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift, Sherman wired the president. Quick word followed that the Army of the Tennessee had marched from Atlanta to the sea and had met hardly more than a brush of resistance. It was a signal for great rejoicing in the North. Then, during the next week, stories about Sherman's march began filtering back, first to the eastern cities and then to the Midwest. They traveled to the quiet farms where barns full of grain and fat stock, where smokehouses were crammed with hams and sides of beef, where apples, cabbages, and potatoes were buried under mounds of earth and straw for winter use, where homes were warm in bitter weather and children slept safely through the nights in feather beds. Out in the Midwest, the railroads were intact and carried the farmers' grain and stock to market. Trade was good and prices high. Throughout this part of the country, the farms lay tranquil under the winter snow, waiting for spring and the plow and the stir of new life. People on these farms and in the cities received stories coming up from Georgia with mixed reactions. The talk among the men who came to visit with Matt at his fireside was all of Billy Sherman's march through Georgia. The Rebs fired on their country's flag. They've held on for all these months and years, and hundreds of thousands of boys have been lost to save the Union their great-grandfathers established. Don't talk to me of mercy. Billy Sherman is giving them the mercy they deserve. My boy wrote that it was like a picnic all the way. They had chicken and pork chops and yams every meal if they wanted them. But they hadn't had grub like that in months. And they burned every fence and house and barn in sight. The railroads, they bent up like hairpins. Over 200 miles of them. A war ain't one that leaves scars like this on folks who be our brothers. Have you heard of Andersonville prison? You know what the Rebs have done in that black hole to their brothers? Well, there's Camp Douglas right here in Illinois. Have you heard stories of that place? It's a terrible thing. It's a pitiful thing. But it's war. The sooner we make one great swoop, the sooner the suffering is over for all of us, South as well as the North. There should be limits, even in war. This was mean, mad destruction. This was a war on babies and their mothers, on the sick and old and helpless. And they brought it on themselves. They have to pay the price. Would their armies have spared us if the tables had been turned? Don't believe it for 1 minute. Word came that the Army of the Tennessee, after reaching Savannah, had turned north to join Grant. It was then that South Carolina knew the lash of a triumphant army, drunk with the plundering of Georgia and enraged at the stubborn tenacity of the South in holding on to a cause that was already lost. In South Carolina, the vast, undisciplined army could find another excuse for its excesses beyond the slogan, "This is war, and war is hell." The role of this state in bringing on the war served as a just excuse for atrocities that no thoughtful man could excuse. This is the nest where Sesh was hatched, the army shouted, and the proud possessions of a gracious life, the little homes of the poor, the cities, the farms, and the frightened, desperate people were swept down before the fury of the Army of the Tennessee. Ed Turner's youngest boy, just 18, and in the Army only a few months, was in South Carolina. Ed brought the boy's letter down for Matt to read. In it, the boy told of the burning of Columbia, of how the soldiers laughed as great wind fanned the flames, of the lute carried off, of mirrors and pianos smashed, and of intimate family treasures scattered to the winds by men who seemed to have gone mad. Ed Turner's hands trembled as he read the letter, or returned the letter to its envelope. What is this going to do to an 18-year-old boy, Matt? Can a lad come through weeks of this kind of actions without becoming a hardened man? Is human life going to be forever cheap to him and decency something to mock at? You and Mary have learned him right from wrong, Ed. But they're being cheered on, Matt. Congress, the whole country is happy with them. These boys are going to believe that they be heroes for looting and burning, for laughing at distress, for smashing the helpless without pity. In some ways, Sammy is more of a child than your Jeth here. He goes with the crowd without thinking. Mary and me has had to guard against that way of his. Matt looked at his friend with troubled eyes. Any words that he could think of seemed useless, worse than silence. Ed got to his feet. Well, surely we'll be over soon. It's got to be over soon. The South can't hold out much longer. That was what the papers were saying, too, along with the politicians and the men who congregated in little groups at the country stores. Surely it will be over soon. The South was starving, its railroads and seaports gone. Grant was only a few miles from Richmond. Thomas was in Tennessee, and Sherman was roaring up through South Carolina. Any week now, any day, any hour, the great terror that had gripped the land for 4 years would be over. Ebb wrote from Tennessee. He was with General Schofield's army, and they were marching toward North Carolina to join Sherman when he reached there. It's going to be all over soon. I figure to be home to help Jeth with the spring plowing and planting. I have not felt in such good spirits since the early days when Tom and me allowed this war was going to be pure fun. We was like foolish young'uns. But the war went on. In Virginia, more soldiers died each day in Grant's army, and in Lee's, because the South, even in its death throes, would not admit defeat. And the tragedy of these deaths was even greater when the hopes of homecoming and peace were just within realization. Jethro had just turned 13 in early 1865. He had grown tall during the years of the war, and although he was still slender, there was a taut look about his body, as if all his muscles had attained a fine precision in working together for the achievement of a needed strength. His face was becoming more angular, and the great blue eyes of his early years were darkened by shifting lights of gray and green. Matt and Ellen noticed a change in him. He was gentle with them and with Nancy and her children, but there was a reserve about him that had grown steadily greater with the years. They watched him anxiously, wondering and sometimes fearing a little. He was so much like Bill. And Bill, the gentlest of all their sons, had walked out of their lives with finality that cut like a knife. To lose Jethro would have been too much. Unconsciously, they clutched at him. It's been long since you have told me of any of the old lessons Shad used to learn you, Jeff, his mother remarked one morning, as she sat before the fire watching him pace aimlessly. He took a handful of crumbs and tossed them out to the sparrows that hopped on crusted snow drifts outside. When he came back, he put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Seems sometimes that the old lessons are being lost in the worry of new things happening each day, Ma, he said quietly. Somehow, I don't have the heart for things that used to set me up so much. What was on your mind just now, Jeff, while you was pacing back and forward? I guess I was thinking of some things Mr. Milton said the last time he spent the night with us, things about the war and peace when it comes. Do you want to tell me of them? I'd be proud to hear the things that are on your mind. Jethro felt a wrench of pity at her little plea, but he stood before her silent and troubled. I can't put it the way Mr. Milton does, Ma, he explained after a while. I can't make you understand. Some things he says I don't quite understand either. I just have a feeling for them, and I can't form the thoughts into good words. Ellen nodded meekly. There were, indeed, many things that she could not understand. Most of Ross Milton's talk was beyond her comprehension. But it was having Jethro show her that she wanted, not an understanding of Ross Milton's words. Jethro walked slowly out of the house. The look in his mother's eyes troubled him. So did the things the editor had talked about on a recent night when he and Jethro sat before the fire in the cabin, after Matt's weariness had forced him off to bed. Don't expect peace to be a perfect pearl, Jeff, Ross Milton warned. This land is a land lying in destruction, physical and spiritual. If the twisted railroads and the burned cities and fields covered with the bones of dead men, if that were all, we could soon rise out of the destruction. But the hate that burns in old scars, and the thirst for revenge that has distorted men until they should be in straitjackets rather than in high office, these are the things that may make peace a sorry thing. Jethro had not liked to hear the editor talk like that. To him, peace had been a shining dream, with Shad and Jenny back home, and John more of a brother now and a hero in Jethro's eyes, with Eb coming home in pride instead of degradation. No, of course, peace would not be a perfect pearl, not with young Tom never to return, not with the possibility of Bill's return, only the most shadowy and remote of chances. Still, peace would mean a glorious sense of relief. In all his years, Jethro had heard either the talk of war's imminence or its reality. He had wished that Ross Milton would not rip up his dream of peace. He had said to the editor that night, "But we have the president, Mr. Milton. Don't you remember the last of his speech a few days ago on Inauguration Day? To bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who should have borne the battle. Won't the president do away with this hate and revenge that you're telling me about?" Ross Milton had taken a brand from the fireplace, carefully between his long fingers. He waited until he had lighted his pipe before he answered Jethro's question. "My hope lies in Abraham Lincoln. He has 4 years before him and the power of a mighty office. If he can control the bigots, if he can allow the defeated their dignity and a chance to rise out of their despair, if he can do this, then maybe peace will not be a mockery." They had talked of the 13th Amendment that night. It had been passed by Congress, and now it was up to the states. Illinois had already ratified it. Jethro felt proud that his state was the first to do so, and there was little doubt that 3/4 of the others would follow, and slavery would be constitutionally abolished once and for all. That's a great thing, isn't it, Mr. Milton? It's a far star, Jeff. It's a dim pinpoint of light in the darkness. Jethro had been provoked. "I don't know why you talk like that," he exclaimed. The editor reached out and put his hand on Jethro's knee. "Because, Jeff, after the 13th Amendment has become a part of our Constitution, and for years afterwards, 25, maybe 50, there will be men and women with dark faces who will walk the length and width of this land in search of the bright promise the 13th Amendment holds out to them." He turned with a sudden thrust of his crippled body to Jethro. "What's going to happen to them, Jeff? What will become of men and women who have known nothing but servitude all the days of their lives? They are without experience, without education. They'll be pawns in the hands of exploiters all over the nation. You watch this thing, Jeff. You watch the abolitionists who have ranted against the South. See if they extend a hand of friendship to the uneducated, unskilled men who will come north looking to them as a savior. Look what has happened to our own armies. Our soldiers have been angered by the dark man who has assumed they were his friends. Sure, the North has talked loudly against slavery. I've joined in that talk, but I tell you, all of us are getting a little quieter when the question comes up as to what we are to do about the products of slavery." Jethro tramped the frozen fields and thought of the things Ross Milton had said. He remembered the supper table that night in mid-April of 1861, and Will Scram's angry voice exclaiming, "Would your abolitionists get the crocodile tears sloshed out of their eyes so they could take the black man by the hand? Would they say, 'We want you to come to our churches and your children to come to our schools'? Why, we dang near forget the difference in the colors of our skins because we are so almighty full of brotherly love. Would it be like that in your northern cities, Cousin John?" The waiting for word of peace went on. February passed. the bitterest cold of the year coming as usual in that month. Then March came, breaking the back of winter with warmth permeating the cold, and with the smell of spring drifting daily to tease hope and to give shy promise of coming radiance. Then, finally, the 5th April of the war arrived. And in southern Illinois, it came in a burst of warmth and color that seemed prophetic to those who waited for word from Washington. That 5th April had moved only into its second week when the news came that the guns were silent, that the terms of peace had been signed by 2 tired men somewhere in Virginia at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. Jethro rode into Newton with Ed Turner and was allowed to spend the night with Ross Milton. By the time he reached the little county seat, the bunting was spread out by the yard, flags flew from almost every house, a long, unused cannon boomed from the cliffs above the river. They had lifted the trapdoor in the roof of the jail, allowing the half-dozen delinquent cities of the county to climb outside so their voices might add to the clamor. Men danced in the streets and embraced one another. Some drank a continuous string of toasts to Lincoln, Grant, and a dozen others, until their bottles were empty, and the compliments had to be started all over again with new purchases at one of the saloons. Others wept while they shouted. There was hardly a home in the county that had not felt the fiery lash of the war's tongue. The editor took Jethro to the restaurant for supper. This time the place was milling with people who had come into town to celebrate. Plump Mrs. Hiles was bustling about in a near frenzy. But she took time to speak to Jethro and to lament his golden curls, which had straightened out into a slightly wavy thatch of light brown hair combed neatly back at the ears. "You ain't as purty as you was 3 years ago, young Crichton," she said brightly. "You're getting a little of the owl look of your friend Ross Milton here." She clapped him on the back briefly and went out to her duties, knowing very well she had said a thing that pleased Matt Crichton's youngest boy. That night, there was a great display of fireworks, and then the town's band played nearly 1,000 voices joined in singing the battle hymn of the Republic. Jethro's heart swelled in his breast. He thought suddenly of the tired face of the president. How I'd like to shake hands with him tonight, he thought. He turned to look at Ross Milton, who stood beside him, balanced painfully on his crutches. The editor's eyes were fixed on something far away above the heads of the crowd, and Jethro noticed that tears were running down his cheeks. At home the next day, he tried to describe the details of the celebration to his parents and to Nancy, who listened with eyes as radiant as Jenny's used to be when she received her first letters from Shadrach. The little boys had caught some of their mother's happiness. "Do you remember him, Jeth?" they asked, with some awe of Jethro's 13 years. "Do you remember what our pa looks like?" Daily, the color of April grew brighter. The apple and peach orchards were in bloom again, and the redbud was about ready to burst. The little leaves on the silver poplars quivered in green and silver lights with every passing breeze, and Jenny's favorite lilacs bloomed in great, thick clusters, deep purple and as fragrant as any beautiful thing on earth. Then suddenly, because there were no longer any eyes to perceive it, the color was gone, and the 5th April had become, like her 4 older sisters, a time of grief and desolation. People would ask for many years, "Where were you when you heard? What were you doing? Who brought you the word?" Jethro would remember a sunlit field and a sense of serenity and happiness such as he had not known since early childhood. He would remember that he had stopped his team when he saw Nancy running toward him, that Nancy's face had been as white as it was during the days of waiting for a letter after the Battle of Chickamauga, that she had sobbed against his shoulder. He thought at first that something had happened to his father, or that word had come of John's being one of those last soldiers to die when peace was almost within reach. Then Nancy said, "Jeth, it's the president. They've killed the president." The work of the farm had to go on. Ellen had washed and scrubbed and cooked for her family the summer her 3 children had died. And in the spring of 65, Jethro went back to the fields and plowed the same furrows he had plowed for the past 4 years. But there was no longer any beauty in the world about him or any serenity in his heart. Sometimes he cried as the closing lines of his letter from the president flashed into his mind. May God bless you for your earnest effort to seek out the right. May he guide both you and me in that search during the days to come. And again, he remembered Ross Milton's words. My hope lies in Abraham Lincoln. If he can control the bigots, if he can allow the defeated their dignity. Little by little, the story came through. Details of the assassination, the attempted murder of the Secretary of State, the nation's wrath and woe, and then the news of a train on its way from the east, a train carrying Abraham Lincoln back to Springfield, Illinois. I want to see him. Just once, I want to look on his face. Springfield is only 100 miles away, but the 100 miles just might as well have been 1,000. The yoke of the farm had settled firmly across Jethro's shoulders. His work in the fields at the proper season was a sole source of food for his parents, for John's family, and for himself. There was no time or opportunity to go to Springfield. No hope of looking upon a face at once the plainest and most beautiful, the humblest and the most magnificent that Jethro would know in his lifetime. It was the saddest and most cruel of the April of the 5. It had held out an almost unbelievable joy, and had then struck out in fury at those whose hands were outstretched. Jethro had learned to accept the whims of fate, schooled as he was in the philosophy of men who work the soil. The rains came, or they were withheld. The heat ripened the grain, or blasted it with a scorching flame. The ears of corn matured in golden beauty, or they were infested by worms and blight. One accepted the good or the evil with humility, for life was a mystery, and questions were not for the lowly. But on the last Sunday of that April, a Sunday of sunlight and bright sky, Jethro lay in the grass on Walnut Hill, and rage mingled with grief in his heart. Why did it happen? Why did it have to happen? He lay with his face close to the earth, clutching the fresh spring grass with both hands. Never before has a president been killed. They've been looked after, watched over, and now this one, the one that has carried the load of this war till he's old and tired, the one that was my friend. He tried for a while to believe that the agony inside him was part of one of the nightmares that have recurred so often ever since the early stories of Wilson's Creek. But the warm April breeze stirred his hair, and the smell of the earth and the cry of birds in the trees above him were a part of reality. This was no dream. Abraham Lincoln had been senselessly slain by the hand of a madman, and Jethro Creighton, with all the people of his time, had suffered an irreparable loss. He heard steps approaching, and a moment later a hand was on his shoulder. He thought it might be Ed Turner, or maybe old Israel Thomas, kind and full of sympathy, but of no help to him in this hour. He could not talk, nor did he wish to listen, so he lay quietly, hoping the intruder would go away and leave him to the pain of this latest and mightiest blow. But the hand was not lifted, and after a long moment someone spoke. Recognition of the voice drew Jethro up in a startled surprise. The man who knelt beside him was thin and gaunt, with a soft dark beard covering his cheeks. He was a young man, but his eyes were tired, and there were a few strands of gray in his dark hair. Jethro would have passed him on the streets of Newton without recognizing him, but the voice had not changed. It was that of his teacher, his brother now, Shadrach Yale. He had not embraced one of his brothers since the days of his very early childhood, but that morning he put his arms about Shadrach, and slowly the joy for the living assuaged the little grief for the dead. "Shad, it's a day I've dreamed about," he said, and even as he spoke, he vaguely wondered why it was that he should whisper the words. Shadrach did not speak at first. He sat looking at Jethro as if he, in turn, doubted the reality of his senses. Shh, okay, go out. Finally, he said, Jeth, how you have grown. How much you look like Bill. I can't believe it. They were silent for a long time, each studying the other's face. An onlooker, not studying the situation, would have wondered at the strange intensity of the two, An onlooker might have believed for a moment that they were man and boy suddenly bereft of their reason. Jethro finally broke the silence. "Jenny?" he asked eagerly. Shadrach smiled then. "She's up at the house, Jeth, all eagerness to see you. I asked if I might come out and find you first. It has been such a long time." "How did you get here, Shad? You didn't let us know." "Mr. Milton met us in Olney last night and loaned us his horse and buggy to drive up here today. We wanted to surprise you. We had hoped it would be a perfect homecoming." He paused. Jethro understood. No perfect pearl. The editor had been right. "I wanted to see him so much, Shad. Pa said that maybe after the war was over I could go to Washington. Maybe I could shake his hand." Shadrach could only nod. He placed his hand for a second on Jethro's shoulder. "Did you see him, Shad? More than the one time you wrote me about? The time he was riding with Grant?" "We saw him that night, Jeff. The night of the 14th. Jenny and I had gone for a stroll after supper, and as we walked along, we noticed that a little crowd had congregated. Then down the street, we saw the president's carriage. There was some cheering, and he looked out at us and smiled. His face looked very old, but it was a happy face that night. I feel sure of it." Shadrach paused as if he were not sure he could say any more, but finally he continued. "We were awakened about 11 o'clock by noise and shouting in the street. We could understand only a few words of the shouting, but they were enough to make us dress and hurry outside. There was a soldier standing on the corner. He was crying, but he told us." The distant horizon blurred a little, and the bird trills and the soft golden blanket of sunlight over the fields and orchards seemed out of place, like laughter in a church. Shadrach was speaking again. "I could take you to Springfield, Jeff. Mr. Milton and I talked about it last night. He doubts if it's best. There's no Abraham Lincoln for you to see, you know, only the empty shell. We think it would only hurt you." "I reckon you're right." "You're going to have to help with the work this summer." Shadrach strove to bring lightness into his voice. "Jenny is going to help your mother. I'll go out to the fields with you. And John will be here in a few weeks. We saw him just a while before we left Washington." Jethro nodded, while a crowd of thoughts raced through his mind. "Will you teach the school again next winter, Shad?" Shadrach's eyes lighted at the question. "That is something I should let Jenny tell you, Jeff, but I can't. I'm going back to college. My uncle can get me a teaching position while I finish my work. And Jenny and I have decided that you're going with us. You've plowed long enough, Jeff. You're going to study now." Jethro's hand found a sharp stick, and he dug it into the earth, twisted it around, and stared at the hole he had made as if it had some meaning. "It would be the finest thing on earth for me, but what about my folks? My ma has lost 3 little boys, and Mary, and Tom, and Bill. I'm the youngest. They depend on me." "You are their pride, Jeff. Those 2 want the very best for you, and they won't be alone. Eb will be back, and there's always John. He wants you to get an education, and then later to help his own boys along the same road. It's going to work out, Jeff. You'll see." Jethro smiled slowly. "Don't build me up too much, Shad," he said after a while. "Something's like to break inside of me." At that moment, a voice sounded across the field from somewhere near the cabin. "Shad! Jeff! You 2 boys better come in now. I'm getting real vexed with both of you." "Yes, let's go see Jenny," Jethro said huskily. They walked together across the bridge that spanned Crooked Creek and through the half-acre south of the cabin, where 4 years before Jethro had helped his mother plant potatoes on a day when the news of Sumter had not quite reached the prairies. A little distance up the road, past the hedge of lilacs and under the silver poplars of the dooryard, Jenny stood at the gate waiting for them. She seemed taller in her city clothes, thinner and more delicate. But she was the same Jenny. Her arms were held out to Jethro, and for that moment, when he ran toward her, all the shadows were lifted from the April morning.